Welcome to Shining the Sunlight on Solar. I'm Dale from Vanlife Outfitters. And good morning. Good morning. So, how many people have enough solar on their vans? And how many people think that today is a good day for solar? I don't see any hands. Um, you would be surprised, actually, that even on a cloudy day, you'll get some. On a cloudy day like this, the direction that your solar panels are pointing doesn't matter so much. The light is diffused by the clouds, and so the light is coming kind of from every direction. So even on a day like this, you'll get some, but that's not. This is not the ideal conditions, obviously, right? So anyway, a little bit about myself. I'm an engineer. And more recently, I took a part-time job with Vanlife Outfitters to do technical support. And solar is one of my hobbies. I like to do hands-on projects, and I have a lot of solar on my house at home and on my van. So solar is like one of my favorite things. Um, solar can make a lot of sense for vans because once you put it up there, it's out of the way. You don't have to set it up each time. On the other hand, if you want to do deployable panels, that's a good way to go too, because you can point them wherever in the right direction, and you can get them away from your van. If you're in the shade, you can put the panels on in the sun. So that's a good reason. It's just one of the several ways that you should handle charging your van. Like, you don't want to rely too much on any one thing. There's solar, there's charging from your alternator while you're driving, and those two things are typically relatively slower. Or the shore power is another way, which can be faster, or then even faster than that is a dedicated secondary alternator, which you can charge back a lot faster. One thing about solar is to understand what you might be able to charge into your battery, depending on where you are, depending on the location and the season and the weather. So this little map is, I don't know if probably too small for anybody to read back there, the specific numbers. But depending on your location, you could get, like in the summertime, it's obviously going to be better because it's the days are longer and the sun is usually out more. In the wintertime, days are shorter. Maybe the weather's not as good. So on a typical van, you might start with 400 watts of panels is something that's typically you can fit on your roof, but it really depends on how much, how big your van is and how many other things you have up there that are also priorities for you. So for a 400 watt panel system with a 12 volt battery, which is like a common, you have to, when you talk about amp hours, you have to say, is it a 12 volt system? And just because that's the most common, that's what I'm going to talk about. So if you had 400 watts of panels, depending on your location in the US and summer or winter, you could be getting anywhere from 50 to 150 amp hours per day. And so that's on a good day. On a cloudy day like this, you could expect maybe a quarter or a third if it's cloudy like this all day. It's still working. Like my van has 800 watts on it, and I looked before I left this morning, so it's still early in the morning also, and you can have a cloudy day like this where it's not so bright right now, but it could also be cloudy and brighter, so it'll do better like that. But anyway, I was getting about 130 watts at 9 a.m. in the morning, so it's still not the middle of the day. It's not sunny, but it's still cloudy, and I was getting like more than an eighth of my panel output. So anyway, you want to think about how much you might get, and then you want to think about how much you think you're going to use. So if your van doesn't have too many electrical loads, so this would be something like 50 to 80 amp hours per day out of a 12 volt system that you're going to use. So if you had just a small 100 amp hour battery, you might be able to get by for one day. And that's just running things like LED lights, maybe a small fridge. A fridge, you got to be careful because it's on all day long. And if it's a chest fridge that you open the lid, the cold air doesn't fall out, that's about the best energy consumption you could have for a fridge. It's not going to use very much. If it's a fridge that you open the door, and especially if it has a freezer section in it, That's one where I'd be more concerned about saying, yeah, you're going to get by, um, calling that a light load. That might be something more like moderate. So if you have an inverter that you use for things, especially if you use it to cook a little bit with, like an induction cooktop, there's not necessarily a lot of energy because it's a short time, or like a microwave. But if you were doing something for a longer period of time, it's worth trying to understand how much energy you're using before you go and rely on solar by itself. And then if you're using air conditioning, that's not really going to cover, no matter how many solar panels you put up, unless it's like a travel trailer. You'll see sometimes travel trailers with solar panels the whole length of it. They'll make a rack, put them on top of the air conditioners. That's kind of overboard maybe for a van, but sometimes that's what people might do. I might do that. Like my van already is just solar panels on top, and I would like to make a way to do more. Even that's going to be hard to keep up with air conditioning, unless it's air conditioning that you just use a couple hours in the evening, and then you're fine the rest of the time with just running the fans. So the first thing I would talk about with solar is understand how much you think you're going to use, even if it's just like a rough idea. I mean, more detail would be do a spreadsheet, like from our website. We have an example, and it has example numbers for all different kinds of devices that you might use, and you can say how many hours I'm going to maybe use this thing, and it'll add up for you how many total amp hours do you think you're going to need to put into your battery bank one way or another, and then how much is solar going to provide that for you, possibly, depending on where you're going to be most of the time. If you're in Phoenix or Denver, summertime, it's pretty good generally, because the sky is typically more clear and the days are longer. But up north, like Seattle or Maine, you're somewhere in the bottom end of that range. A next key thing to understand, sort of a basic thing about electricity, is that your panel voltage needs to be a little bit higher than your battery voltage. The charge controller has to have a voltage that's about 5 volts at least higher than your battery voltage. So typically when you see a panel and it says it's a 12 volt panel, that means it's suitable for charging a 12 volt battery. So it means that the voltage that it's going to put out is something about 18 to 20 volts, which is 5 volts or more higher than the charging voltage of the battery. So 12 volt battery is somewhere 14 and a half, or maybe even a little more, is what once the battery is full, it's going to be up to that level. So if you have a 24 or 48 volt battery system, then you need to have panels that are either individually some higher voltage, or you're going to put them in series to get the higher voltage for that. If your voltage is really close to that limit, then what'll happen is that at the beginning of the day and the end of the day, the charge controller won't be able to turn on. So you'll be losing some production at both sides of the day. And then in the middle of the day, it'll still be okay, because by that time the panel voltage gets high enough, and then the charge controller can turn on. Then the next thing is understanding parallel and series. And so parallel is where you wire both panels, their positives together and the negatives together. So in that case, the voltage is the same. It's the same as paralleling two 12 volt batteries together. You still have 12 volts. And the current is going to add together, because you have two of them working in parallel with each other. And so you get twice as much power versus just the first one. For a van, for campers, usually this is the most common way to do it. The one advantage of this is that it's a little bit better for shading. So if there's shade on one panel, the other panel is still working fine. And that's because the voltage is connected together between the two panels. The voltage is still the same, and the one that's in the sun is still putting out the same current that it normally would. The one that's in the shade just doesn't put out as much current. So you still get, instead of getting 10 amps, like 5 plus 5, you might get like 5 plus 2. and so that's good. That's fine. Um, you have to be careful if you're going to parallel more than two panels together. There's an issue to think about with adding additional fuses, because when you have two panels in parallel like this, if the wiring or the panel itself were to be shorted out, the other panel is still trying to power it. And that's okay if you just have two of them, because one of them is no more powerful than the other one. And so they're rated for a certain current that they can put out or that they can handle. And so if you only have one other panel that's the same, trying to short out the other panel, nothing bad is going to happen. It's not going to catch on fire. But once you have three or more of these, if you try to wire three or more in parallel, then you can have one panel or part of the wiring that's shorted out, and that wiring can only handle, its nominal amount of current. But now you've got two or more panels feeding into that one, and so that's where you can have that panel or that wiring could overheat. So then you should have fuses in this wiring, so that the one that's shorted out can blow its own fuse, and the other ones can go on producing normally. If you put the panels in series, that would be like you're stacking them on top of each other. So if you're doing this with batteries, you put two batteries together, one on top of the other, and then you get 24 volts instead of 12 volts. So in this case, the voltage adds together if you just daisy chain them together, one after the other. And the current is the same for all the panels, because it's just like one hose. If you put water into one end of a hose, you get the same amount of water out the other end of the hose. No matter how many hoses you put together, it's still the same flow, the same current going through both of them. So you get more voltage, but the current is the same. And that's nice, because especially if you're going to put a whole bunch in series with each other, then whatever the wire size is to start with is plenty for all of them. But if you start paralleling a bunch of them together, individually they might have like number 10 or number 12 AWG wire on the panels, and then you'll think, oh, I'll just use number 10 for the rest of it. That's fine if you had like maybe two panels, but once you start adding more in series, you might have to have like number 8 or even number 6 after you've paralleled them all together. So you need some bigger wire, and then the fusing issues if you do that. So if you put them in series, because of the way the current flows through them, if one of them is shaded, that one can't put out as much current. And so that's going to limit the current that's able to go through the other ones. So the total, instead of getting, like 5 plus 2 over here, and you get 7, in the same way, the 5 and the 2 like capability that you had, the 2 is going to limit the other one. So now you're going to, instead of getting 5 plus 2, you're going to get 2 plus 2. So the panel that's able to do the least is going to limit the rest of them to the same current. So it's, on a van, a lot of times you're usually in the sun or you're not in the sun. So I'm not sure that that's a big deal. But the parallel way, if you're going to have like your air conditioner is next to one panel and it might shade it sometimes, that's when parallel would be better for that. Any questions so far? Yeah, go ahead.
With parallel and series, does using one or the other help with using something that requires higher watts or higher voltage?
So with the battery voltage and with the solar charge controller, how you wire them is going to go into that selection. So if you parallel them together, then you're getting more current. So you need a charge controller that can handle more current, which usually, to handle more current, it needs to be bigger. And it'll be more expensive. A charge controller that handles higher voltage is not necessarily more expensive, because it handles, you'd have like a 20 or 30 amp charge controller running at higher voltage, and a 20 or 30 amp charge controller is less expensive than a 50 or 60 amp charge controller. It'd be like $200 versus $300 maybe. It's not that big a deal. But it would mostly go into which charge controller you choose. And the battery voltage too in the system. If you want to have a lot of solar You can do it with a 12-volt system, 12-volt battery, but then you'll end up having to have multiple or larger charge controllers to handle the current. And if you want to get a certain amount of power, it's volts times amps. And so if your voltage is just limited to 12 volts, then you need to have lots of amps. But if it's a higher voltage system, 24 or 48 volt battery, then you can have lower amps and smaller wires, smaller charge controller, and still, however much solar you want.
Does it just put out more power though in series because you have a 24 volt?
The power that you get, it would still be like how many panels you have is the power. But if you wired them together, you could wire them together either way, and you could get the same amount of power. It's just that the one that's in parallel with higher current is going to require a bigger charge controller.
Got it.
So this will be getting into more details. On the back of your panels, there's going to be a little data sheet, or the manual for it, or the specification sheet for your panels. The first thing is how much power it has. So that's kind of what you're asking. Like, if I put together more panels, I get more power. And if you, depending on how you wire them, it's either more amps or it's more volts. But either way, it'll be the same amount of power. So there's four main numbers on the back of the panels. One is the short circuit current, so ISC, and that means if you were to short out the panel, like just plug the leads together, or if your charge controller fails, that's the most power that the panel can put out. So it's kind of like a battery. The current is somewhat unlimited if you short it out, but a solar panel, even if it's in bright sun, it's only going to put out a certain amount. It's only going to do the most that it can do. There's no magic that's going to make it produce twice as much as that suddenly. And so that goes into how big the wires have to be, depending on how you put them in series or parallel, how big the solar charge controller has to be, that kind of thing. The next important number is the open circuit voltage, or VOC. And that means when the panel is open circuit, when it's not connected to anything, what's the maximum voltage that it will produce. And in the morning, morning and the evening, when there's not quite enough light, but there's still some light, the charge controller doesn't turn on because it can't do anything with it. It sees the voltage, but it tries, can't really pull any current, so it turns off. But the charge controller still sees that voltage, so you can't have a voltage that's higher than what the charge controller can tolerate. And so that's the kind of the one key thing. You can't, if you have a charge controller that's good for 100 volts, and you put panels together that are close to 100 volts, or ever, even once, go over it, the charge controller will fail. So this VOC also, it's not, there's one number, but that's for standard conditions and temperature. When the panels are cold, it actually puts out a higher voltage. The cells work better when they're cold. And so you need some headroom for it. You can do a specific calculation of, I'm going to be the worst case, like minus 40 degrees Celsius or something, like really, really cold. And what's the coefficient for this particular panel? But the simple answer is you need to stay away from it by, 10 or 20 volts even maybe. If you add together, if you have panels that are like 20 volt panels, you could put 4 of those together on a 100 volt charge controller, but I wouldn't put 5. Like if they add up to like 98 volts, after 5 of them, that's gonna fail your charge controller before too long. Then the next two numbers are the current and the voltage at maximum power. So that's under ideal conditions or some specific test conditions, how much current and voltage does it put out? So the panel, the way it works, this chart shows the current and the voltage at a given illumination. So if there's more light or less light, this curve is going to move up or down a little bit. And the charge controller the charge controller is going to see that there's voltage, and then the charge controller is going to take a little bit of current and see what happens to the voltage. So the charge controller, the maximum power point tracking charge controllers, are going to do a little experiment with how much current can I pull and where do I move on this curve. And if you multiply the current and the voltage together, you get power. And so the charge controller is going to experiment with the current that it pulls, and it's going to find, how do I get the most power right now? Because there's always like a cloud coming by, or it's getting brighter or darker, or the angle of the panels is different, or whatever. So that's what the charge controller does. And the points on this this chart, the short circuit current is the end up here. If the charge controller were to completely short out the leads, the input, it will pull the voltage all the way down to 0 between those, and it will observe some amount of current flowing through it. That's this point up here. If it did the opposite thing, if it let go and it did not pull any current, it would go over here to the VOC point. I didn't label it on here, but it would be this spot right here. And that's the one where you don't want that to get higher than what your charge controller can handle. The charge controllers, even if it's not a Victron one, typically there's 2 numbers involved with the charge controller. The Victron ones just go by these, 100/30 means 100 volts is the most that it can accept as input, and then the second number is the maximum output current. So I already kind of talked about the maximum input voltage is a hard limit. You can't go over this limit. It's gonna smoke. It's gonna not work anymore. The second number, though, the maximum output current, it's perfectly fine to over panel and let the charge controller run at its maximum point. It's just going to do the most that it can do, and it will clip. It will instead of, if it can only pull a certain amount of power because it's limited, it's not able to pull output more current. It's just going to adjust and only put out 30 amps, and that's fine, because the solar panels cost something, the charge controller costs something. You don't want to spend a lot of money on a charge controller just for the one perfect day of the year that you're going to be in a location that has perfect sun and your panels are aligned and making the very most. Most of the time the panels are not going to make anywhere near that, so it's fine to let them have a charge controller that's a little bit smaller and less expensive and spend more money on panels. The panels are generally maybe a little, I don't know, it depends on what kind of system you're putting together, but that's perfectly fine to do. Nothing bad's going to happen from that. It's only better. You're going to get a little more power earlier in the day, a little more power in the end of the day, and then all day long you're going to get 30 amps out of it instead of just at that one time, one day of the year you get 30 amps. Any more questions so far?
Yeah. When it comes to solar panels, if I want to know if the solar panel is like brand new technology or old, is there something that I can do while I'm looking at one? Like I want to buy one secondhand.
Yep.
Can I look at it or read something that tells me if it's new or old?
Yeah, that's a great question. And that's one of the things I was going to talk about too, like different types of panels. And typically monocrystalline or polycrystalline panels, these will be hard, fixed, rigid panels. Those are going to be more efficient, especially than amorphous panels, which are flexible and they don't have cells in them. They're just different layers of chemicals all put together. Those are great for some applications, but not for vans because they're heavier and they're lower output. Those would be like Harbor Freight 100-watt panels. They might be flat, but if you look at them, there's no cells in them. Those are going to be a lower efficiency. And so on the data sheet, you can look and see they'll sometimes say a certain efficiency. But you could also measure what's the physical size of the panel, how many square inches or how many square feet or whatever, and then how many watts does it claim to put out. And you can compare them that way. So there's newer, about now, most residential panels are getting to be higher efficiency, somewhere like 22 or 23%. If you're getting residential panels or older panels, they could be 18, 20% efficiency. That's not the efficiency that you'd get just between like area and the wattage, but you could do the, how big is this panel, how many watts is it, to compare them directly. Because whatever somebody's going to quote on as a certain efficiency, I'm not sure I trust whether everybody used the same conditions to evaluate it.
Does the rated max power mean anything though?
Yeah, I mean it should. Yeah, it should be the rated power at standard test conditions. There's STC, but there's several different standard test conditions too. So the easiest comparison would be how much area, like will it fit on my van in the first place, and then how big is it, how heavy is it? On my van, I have two residential sized panels, but they're relatively thinner frames. They're a little flimsier, and then there's like commercial panels which have thicker frames and they're heavier. I wouldn't necessarily put those on a van because they're kind of heavy.
I have 3 panels on my van, and it looks the same as what was on my house.
Mm-hmm.
So residential
Yeah.
things like that.
Yeah.
So what's a dope like me that's just driving the van around need to know or need to look for? How is it efficient? How is it? I mean, because stuff works when I plug it in, But I'm not building the system, and I didn't have a lot of history on the van that I do have.
So you want to know, is it working correctly or not, or?
What do I have to know, and how do I evaluate it?
I would look to see if it looks like it's charging a battery. So on a sunny day, is your state of charge going up? And if you have a monitor that can show you how many amps are going into your battery, you can look and see, if it's sunny out, how many amps are going in.
Does the Victron show that?
Depending on which Victron thing you have, yeah. Yep. The Smart Shunt or the Serbo and the touchscreen or the BMV 712 are all able to show you directly what's going into the battery. If you have a charge controller from Victron or other ones, will show you how many amps or watts is coming directly from the solar at that time. So yeah, you could look at that, instrumentation and see if it's working or not. So to continue the previous question too about the panels, for vans, typically the ones that we sell are anywhere from 100 to 200 watt panels. And they have a frame that's about this thick too. The residential ones sometimes are like 1.5 or 2 inch thick frames, which are like what I'd say is heavy ones. All the ones that are typically you'd use on a van are roughly anywhere from, like 18 to 20 inches wide to 3 to 4 feet long. That size of panel is best for the Tetris you're going to play to fit everything on your roof. And we have a good blog post also about selecting panels and the whole solar system on our website. If you just search solar, that blog post should come up, and there's some discussion there about choosing panels. One of the first things is just what is going to fit on my van, and you kind of want to, there's other things that you definitely want, like a fan or air conditioner on top, or you want to walk on your roof or something. All those things, your solar is probably what's going to fit in the rest of that. That's what most people do. I did the opposite. I was like, I'm going to put all solar, and then I'll find a way to do everything else after that.
Thank you. I will look at the blog. I haven't yet. But I have 400 watts. I'm doing okay so far. But I know there is more potential for it to crack in the middle, but it hasn't. But also, I'd love to walk on it someday, but I can't now. So I'm happy, but of course I'm always looking at upgrades. And the 3 things I'm looking at is I just heard about paintable solar panels, if you could talk on that.
Yeah.
But yet, I know that it's best to have a 1-inch gap, so how to build that 1-inch gap underneath a paintable solar panel.
Oh.
And the other thing is it would be awesome to have a smaller one that has a better frame that I can stow inside the car while driving up on the roof, like in a cargo thing, or
Oh.
something better than a cargo net, you know, something you could sell. But also I could hang two on the east side to get that morning sun,
Mm-hmm.
and then you would build a rack that's sturdy enough to hold it in high winds.
Mm-hmm.
And then in the afternoon, I could take those two panels and move them to the west
Yeah.
side. So, who's going to sell that for me?
Walking around, there are lots of people using deployable solar panels,
I have
and
that, yeah.
and I would definitely recommend that.
Go away,
Yeah, but I mean, you can stake them down and you can move them different places. You could even put them on the top of your van so that you'll get some while you're driving, but I'd be careful about them, blowing off.
I already have the 400 watt.
Yeah, so it would be neat to walk on solar panels, but usually you shouldn't. You can step on them, and if they don't break, then they're fine. But it's a crystal. The solar cells are hard crystalline stuff. They're not meant to flex back and forth. So just being on a van in the first place and vibration is probably not, it's not great for them. But they're gonna probably last a long time. The paintable thing, yeah, that's a new alleged technology in the last 10 years that I've heard about. There were in my previous job, people were pushing that, and that is like that's amorphous panels. So I'm forgetting the name is slipping now, but like 15 years ago, it was it was a big thing. There's a really smart guy that worked a lot on it at a company in Michigan, and but those are just lower output. They can be less expensive because it's easy to just like spray paint stuff on in layers if you do it right, and then it can be a solar panel, but it's not as efficient as the crystalline type of panels. Was there another question in there too?
Like a frame for,
oh.
like on the outside, I would like to see a smaller frame so that I could take them inside when traveling if I were to put them on the east side and west side temporarily. But I need it to be a really smaller frame, but strong, so I can put it up
Yeah.
in the roof.
So there's another one. I don't know that the company exists anymore, and I don't recall the name of it, but there was a blogger, a YouTuber. I think it's called his channel is called Project of Science. I think it's called, and he's a van builder. I forget where, but he used once or twice these very lightweight solar panels that have a carbon fiber backsheet and either really thin glass or not glass on the front of them, so they're really light. And so there's a few different brands of that type of solar panel, but they're pretty expensive. So that's another opportunity too.
Yeah, I was just wondering what the pros and cons of mixing and matching solar panels, like sizes and
Yep.
types.
That's a really fun question for somebody that likes charts like myself. And so if you put panels together, like what we talked about with parallel and series, and then these charts, that's what happens. You can do it. Ideally, the panels should be matched so that, especially if you put them in parallel, then the voltage, because they're wired together, you're forcing the voltage to be the same between the two panels. And so that means that the charge controller, it only has one choice. It can change the current and move the voltage around, but you have two of these curves from two different panels that are different, and you're forcing both of them to operate at the same voltage, and each one will have a different current. The current adds, but that means it may not be significant. The power curve for the two panels is going to be a little bit different. And I have a Sharpie. And so, for example, you have this one panel that might look like that, and you might have another panel that's higher power. But if their maximum power voltage is at the same voltage, then because you wire them in parallel and the voltage is the same, they're going to work both. It's great. It's perfect. So if they have the same voltage, the same maximum power point voltage, and you put them in parallel, that's perfect, because the charge controller can keep them both at the same. But if they're if they're a different voltage panel by a little bit, by like 1 or 2 volts, then say it was these two, what you're gonna operate both of them at the same voltage, and they're still pretty close to the maximum power, so that's not going to hurt anything either. So it's how much different they are. That's the one thing about the voltage. And then if you were to put them in series with each other, you have to be careful about the current, because you wouldn't want to put like a 100 amp panel, even if they're the same voltage panels, but you have a 100 amp and then you have a 100 watt panel and a 200 watt panel. The 100 watt is like half the amps. If they're both like 12 volt panels, they'll put out like 18 or 20 volts, but one of them is going to put out say 5 amps and one's going to put out say 10 amps. And because the current has to be the same between them, the 5 amp panel is going to kneecap the other one, and so you're going to get 5 amps out of both of them instead of 5 and 10. So you can do that, and then you think about, how do I wire them differently? Or technically the better solution is just to put them both on their own separate charge controller, especially if they're in different locations. Like one of them is, I don't know, on one side of your van, or one's a deployable panel. For deployable panels, it's probably best if you had a separate charge controller, because you're going to move that around and point it at the sun, and the other one is just on your roof. Does that sound good? I'll get you next.
Yeah, a follow-up on that question of parallel operation.
Yep.
If you had two different panels, and one of them is making so many volts, and the other one would like to make so many volts, would one backfeed the other, or do they only conduct in one direction?
Yeah, that's another point I didn't mention at all. The panels typically have a diode built into them that prevents current from flowing back the other way, and that's part of the ISC, the short circuit current limit of the panel, would have to do with that diode too. So if you wired them up, especially if you did if you wired several panels in parallel with each other, and one of them is shaded, then you're relying on the diode from that panel is seeing power or voltage from the other two panels, and that's where the fuses might be important.
But that should be okay then.
Yeah. As long as you're staying within, as long as you're just two panels in parallel with each other, that's fine. If you start to put multiple panels in parallel, that's when like if there's a short, or even if just one panel is shaded and you got a bunch of other panels in parallel with it, the other panels are putting out power, and it could harm the other one by like overdoing what that diode can handle.
Okay, thanks.
Yep.
Filament light bulbs burn out. LED light bulbs burn out. We have a solar panel, an PPT, we've got a charge control, we've got a battery. Battery just have a cycle count. So all these things, one, do they burn out? And why do they burn out? And what can we do to prolong the life or maximize the usefulness of all these components?
Yep. The solar panels will degrade by a certain percent every year over time. Like maybe, I don't know if it's just linear over time. I think it's probably just kind of linear over time. The batteries is more, they might degrade initially, but then they should last a longer time after that, if nothing else happens. And the charge controllers, I would be nervous about making sure that they're not going to overheat. So if they have cooling fins on the back of them, they should be mounted vertically. That's the best way. And whatever compartment they're in, there should be some ventilation. Yeah, I don't know that there's anything particular you could, other than keeping the charge controller in a nice environment, where it's going to be relatively cool. And the solar panels, I mean, they're in the sun all the time, and they make more power if they're cooler. But I wouldn't like spray water on them to cool them down. You might crack them or whatever. It's just not worth. It's not worth your trouble to try to do that.
So I'm saying there's not a whole lot we can do once installed.
Yeah, I don't think so. Not really. I mean, if they're flat on your roof in the wintertime, like don't let piles of snow, because they're gonna get pressed down and they might crack from that.
Is the battery cycle, should we be trying to keep it at 90 and above the state of charge, or deep cycle each one of those things? Does that matter?
With the lithium batteries, with the lithium iron phosphate batteries, the state of charge that you're at is not. You don't want to be totally empty. You do want to be generally somewhere in the middle, or near full is good. Everybody has lithium iron phosphate batteries. EV batteries in cars, most of those are different chemistry, and those are not exactly the same. Those, there's more reason to keep those somewhere in the middle state of charge versus all the way at the top or all the way at the bottom. But lithium iron phosphate is okay to keep them full. And the cycle count, lithium iron phosphate is supposed to be many, many cycles, like thousands and thousands of cycles. So I wouldn't really worry about it.
3,500, because I just looked that up. And that's 10 years.
Yeah, exactly.
Every day.
I know, it's a long time.
Yeah, so you shouldn't have to worry about it. If you still have lead acid batteries, then that's a whole different thing. And they want to be full. But I think that's really not, hardly anybody has those anymore.
Thank you.
So. Any other ideas or questions? Yeah.
Is there a component within this entire system that would be considered more important or better to splurge on or have a more robust system to help with any stuff that's lacking?
I'm not sure. Like, which, if any, you mean the whole system or just the solar part of it?
Should I spend more money on a charge controller? Should I spend more money on panels or
batteries?
The batteries super important? Is there anything that should be just the best and everything else can be leisure?
Yeah. Charge controllers, if they work, they work. And if it's an MPPT charge controller, it's going to be pretty efficient. I like systems that like you can have an all-in-one system, and that's a good way to go, as long as it all works. But everything is in there, and I can't open it up and take it apart. I can, but that's sort of more hobbyist sort of thing to do. If everything's separate components, then if you have trouble with any particular one, then you can get a different one. The all-in-one type of thing is, it's all neat in the box, and there's nothing that you don't have to build it really, so that's an advantage. But, and the separate components, you can make a fancy system, you can still change it over time. So that's kind of what I prefer actually, is separate components and things. Something that you can see what it's doing. So the Victron ones, you can connect to it with Bluetooth and you can see what it's doing. I wouldn't really get one that doesn't let you see what's going on somehow. Either have a display on it that lets you see how many amps and volts is it doing, like for the charge controller. For the same thing for your batteries, I would want to see one that you can look at it with Bluetooth and monitor it and see what's going on.
Dale, if you have one that has a bunch of components, is there one of the components that you should really get the best that you could spend a lot on one of these components?
Yeah, I'm not sure how to answer that. Whether there's, I would. You decide on what kind of system you want to have and how much storage you need to have, and how fast you need to recharge. So it goes back to like, how do you want to use your van, and that's going to help define how big you want your battery to be and how fast you need to recharge it. And so if you need to recharge faster, then you could have a smaller battery bank. And a large part of the cost, like probably the largest cost in the system, is the batteries. And so I'm not saying to minimize that, but I would want to get batteries that are good quality, and potentially that you can expand. If you're going to have a system that you need to recharge faster, like a secondary alternator system, then you need to have batteries that have the communication to be able to do that. So deciding what you want your system to do, I think, is first, and then you can talk about which thing to splurge on the most. And I guess batteries is probably the key part, because I think that's generally the largest cost. And the second cost would be the inverter charger, could be, and then charge controllers are usually smaller cost than that, and probably similar to solar panels in cost. Like panels are $100 or $200 a piece, and the charge controller is like usually something like $200 usually.
So my question was, when you talked about a secondary charge controller, if I had external,
Oh, yep.
how are those working together? Or
So they're just two separate things. They're both charging the battery separately, and that's okay.
overcharge it? If
No,
you're thinking-
each battery, so the charge controllers, at least a decent charge controller like the Victron ones, you can program it for the battery that you have, and you specify, this is the charge voltage I want to use for absorb. Like when the battery's not very full, it's going to charge as hard as it can, and then once it's full, it's going to say I'm in float mode now, and it'll lower the voltage a little bit. You should get a charge controller that's quality, that has those options. Other charge controllers is just a black box. You plug it in. It says it has lithium on it, and it's got like one light on it. It may work, but you can't verify what it's doing. You can't see there's no other information.
But both controllers are going to see the same stats from the feedback from the battery.
Yeah. So
Both shut down.
both charge controllers are connected to the battery the same way, and if you program and configure both of the charge controllers correctly, then they're both gonna, okay, it looks like I can absorb charge now, and they'll do that, and then at about the same time, they will both switch to float mode. If you have a fancier monitoring system, if that's the kind of thing you want, then the servo and touchscreen setup, the charge controllers can communicate to the servo, the central controller, and the central controller can do distributed voltage and current control. So it can tell all the different devices at the same time, hey, now the battery is in float mode. So now all the devices at the same time switch to the other target voltage, and they don't even use their own configured voltages that you said previously. It uses what the servo says to use, which is what it heard from the batteries, what the batteries wanted. And so with the SOK batteries and the Victron batteries and the Epic batteries, some of the Epic batteries, they can do that type of control. And that's especially if you're going to have a secondary alternator system, you need to have that so that the batteries and the controls can tell the regulator for the secondary alternator, hey, it's time to stop charging because we're full, or something else will happen. So I saw hands over this way.
You mentioned about the charge controller that you have to keep it cool and all. I mean, I'm in a hot climate a lot. I just wanted to ask if you do burn out a charge controller, is it just going to go blank or show an error code or something where you know it's that?
So it could stop working, and you'll see that. The other charge controllers can be either isolated charge controllers or non-isolated, and most of them are non-isolated, which means if they fail, then the solar panel is connected straight through. This is one failure mode. It's not necessarily the most common or anything, but it can happen. The solar panel is directly connected to the battery, and that's fine. Well, that's not fine. The solar panel will still charge the battery, but not at the optimal voltage, because the panel, it's going through the charge controller, but the charge controller is not working anymore. It's just connected. It's shorted. It can be shorted straight through, and it'll charge your battery very slowly for a long time. Eventually, your battery will get full. Depending on how the rest of your system is set up, the lithium battery will disconnect itself, and now whatever else is still connected to your system, like lights and water pump or fans or whatever, the solar panel PV voltage will come straight through, which will be higher, and you'll see high voltage on your system. So that's something to just sort of watch for, I guess. But first, you would see, oh, my solar is not working normally anymore, and then you'd look into it, and that's what you find.
Monitor, you should see higher voltage.
You would see first that the solar panel is not producing as much power as it does in the past, because the solar panel voltage is shorted to the battery voltage. So instead of seeing,
It's not showing as many amps.
yeah, it won't show as many amps and it won't show as many volts. So that's another good reason to have
But
some
the
kind of.
screen on the charge controller would also either go blank or show an error code or something.
Well, typically the charge controllers don't have a screen at all anyway, but your monitoring would show you that. Yeah.
Hey Dale, I think we need to close
Yeah.
out. Maybe let them know they can come ask questions.
Yeah, so I'll be at the tent all the time, so you can, any other detailed questions and stuff. Yeah, so.